All right. Okay, well, first of all, thanks so much for having us here this evening. We really do appreciate it. And thank you, Rebecca, for that little flyover video just to get people oriented to the museum. I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about the work of Carleton Mitchell. But before I get started, I just need to make a quick pitch. We've had a long time partner with Gallery Group, who was our risk management partners. And back when I used to do these presentations in person and fly all over the country, they were the underwriter to cover my travel expenses. Last year, I think the last in-person presentation I did was February, way back when, February 2020. But anyways, they've decided to continue to sponsor and promote the museum, and they've been a great partner. And in fact, they were the ones who actually insured our whale ship, the Charles W. Morgan, when she went out on her celebratory 38th voyage around New England. So great group, and if you're in the market, give them a call. So I just want to let everybody know that I am not at all an expert on Carleton Mitchell or his life, or even his collection here at Mystic Seaport. However, I have been smitten by Carleton Mitchell's work and really enjoy sharing it with other like-minded enthusiasts and sailors. So tonight we're going to just talk briefly about Carleton Mitchell's early years. Then we're going to talk about how he went to the Caribbean and really opened up the Caribbean in the post-World War II period. Talk a little bit about his famed vessel Finisterre, which was a tremendous racing success, and then go on to his latter years when he converted over to powerboating and did a little power cruising. And this is given this talk a bunch of different times, but one of the most memorable was down at the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club in Florida, which is still a men's only membership club, and so the ladies aren't invited to come to the evening talks, which I thought.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Can you do us a favor? The volume here is a little bit low. Can you speak a little bit closer to the computer?
Sure.
Or louder so we can hear you a bit better.
Sure, I can. So anyways, cut to the chase. I was able to present this slide talk to Carleton Mitchell's widow, Ruth, over a luncheon. And it was just such a magical experience to see her reliving all of these voyages they took together, and such a memorable moment for me. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that first. And as we get going, Rebecca showed you a video which talks about, or showed the kind of the right side of this image, which is the public museum on the river. 17-acre campus. This is where our tall ships are, 4 National Historic Landmarks, all of our indoor exhibitions building, our living history village, our working shipyard, all of that good stuff. Tonight, I'm going to introduce you to some of what exists on the other side of the street in that red circle. That's our Collections Research Center, and that's where we house all of our reserve collections and make them available for researchers. Things like our maritime paintings, our scrimshaw, our ship's plans collection, thousands of sheets of ship's plans, our beautiful trophy collection, a gorgeous collection of silver trophies from throughout yachting history. And these are objects that we collect because of the stories contained in them, and we make these collections available for researchers. Some of them, like the photography collections, the Rosenfeld collection in particular, are really working collections where we are able to generate revenue. But one of the principal purposes for these collections is to populate exhibitions at the museum. And so currently running now is an exhibit called Sailor Made, all about the handcrafts and trade crafts made by the sailors while at sea or while ashore, inspired by their time at the sea. And coming up next, opening in September, is an exhibit called Sea as Muse, talking all about the inspiration the sea provided for various artisans, and featuring that very same silver trophy collection. We look at those trophies often as documentary objects or artifacts. We're interested in the vessels that won the race, the history of the race, the location of the race. We had a curator come in and really look at the collection from the viewpoint of a silversmith and silver manufacturing. And lo and behold, to us, said, wow, you have some of the finest example of the best makers of silver ever. So we're pretty excited about Sea as Muse opening up in another couple of weeks here. Seems like, can't believe August is almost over, but I think that's only about 3.5 weeks out. Anyways, let's get into the story of Carleton Mitchell. He was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in August of 1910. And this is a photo taken at about that period on Lake Pontchartrain of a group of boats called the Fish Class, not the Herreshoff Fish Class that we're familiar with, but a different class that was sailed down south. Mitch's parents divorced when he was quite young, and his mother took him to St. Petersburg to be with his uncle. He sailed with his uncle out of St. Pete in the 1920s, early 20s, racing and sailing as far down as the Florida Keys. And then he went back to home in New Orleans, where he continued to pursue his sailing on the lakes and in the Gulf. He ultimately attended the Miami of Ohio University, but he ended up leaving in his junior year, right at the start of the outset of the Depression. After he left college, he had a series of jobs working in a lumber camp in Minnesota, working at Macy's in New York, and then ultimately quit his job to get on a schooner and sail down to the islands. He sailed from Norfolk down to the Bahamas, where he spent considerable time in and around Nassau. The image you see in front of you is actually his original Cruising Club of America card, and it's also an object or an item in our collection. Much of what you're going to see tonight comes from our collections, including some of the oral history recordings we'll hear. And so the next slide is actually an image. The first image we'll see of faraway places in an earlier time, an image of the Bahamas. And we're going to hear Carleton Mitchell in his own voice as part of an oral history recording, talking about his first trip down to the islands and what he saw there.
Occupation was the bootlegging, because prohibition was in effect, and we would lie there in the harbor, and at dusk every night, old seaplanes, single-engine pusher planes would take off for Florida race, and a succession of very sleek boats, the forerunners of today's cigarettes and scarabs and the rest of it, would take off into the wild blue yonder, powered by World War I surplus Liberty motors.
So Mitch served in the Navy during World War II, where he actually was assigned to a photography unit, one of the early endeavors of the Navy to capture their activities on film. His only deployment was at sea, was on board a brief stint on board the Ranger, USS aircraft carrier Ranger, which was deployed off of the coast of North Africa during that particular period. And it was subsequent to the war that he embarked on what would become his career. This happens to be an image of one of his early cameras, this little Rolleiflex. But from a very young age, Mitch told his mother that what he really wanted to do was be a writer, that he wanted to sail around the world and write about it. And this was the career he embarked on after the war. Initially, he did a lot of sailing and a lot of writing, but didn't have a whole lot published until one day an editor asked him, "Hey, have you got any photographs to go along with these stories?" And I guess the rest, as they say, is history, because he began to submit his stories richly illustrated with photography, which really launched his career. He combined writing and photography and published a number of books, and his writing appeared in all the major magazines of the day, perhaps most prominently National Geographic and Sports Illustrated. In 1946, he purchased John Alden's Malabar 12, and renamed her Carib, and set off to the Caribbean, writing for National Geographic. He went back a year later with his wife Elizabeth, his first wife Elizabeth, and wrote this book, Islands to Windward, which was his first major publication, and it inspired sailors all across America to take their own boats down to the Bahamas and the Caribbean. And in the preface, what he writes is, "I tried to make real the little towns, roofs peeping through the palms, and the lonely beaches, and the sparkling sea, and the soft trade wind. In short, I've tried to make this a story for everyone who might travel to the West Indies, including those who make their voyages without ever leaving the chair by the fire." And so I don't know if he was the true originator of that phrase, armchair sailor, but certainly he sold a lot of books to the likes of armchair sailors along the way, and inspired quite a few people to actually take to the sea on their own boats. So I'm just going to cut through a few images here of what he witnessed early on, opening up the islands. This is down in Haiti, Henne Bay in Haiti, just some work boats up on the beach. You can see here a schooner in Grand Cayman Island. These are service numbers, we think, from the war. It might have been a picket boat or a coastal patrol boat. You can see here an interesting shot in Trinidad. He has a lot of these kind of architectural photos, compositionally really quite stunning. And I would love to see the old cars. Down in the right corner, you can see that old car trucking around. This is the open air market in St. George in Granada, still a fairly common scene in a lot of the smaller communities down in the islands. And this is an image of Kingston in St. Vincent, Kingston. and it's a schooner careening. And so you can see this is his Ketch, a Caribbean, a later boat after the Alden schooner, is in the frame to the left. And in the frame to the right, you can see a couple of boats that look lashed together. And this was how they would, in the very old early days, they would careen boats by putting them on the beach and wait for the tide to go out. But this is a somewhat different approach where you have two boats in the bay strapped alongside each other, one of which has derricks on it and heels. You can see the schooner being winched down and heeled over this motorboat. And it's just a way to be able to work on the bottom of the vessel without hauling it all the way out. This is in Martinique. This is a shot from the Yacht Club dock in Martinique. And now we've sort of skipped forward to really just after World War II again. And Martinique, of course, was a French possession, and the Vichy government had been in power just, about a year or so before this visit. And ports like this were used during the war for U-boats, submarines, for refueling and provisioning. And now here he is just a few months later down doing some cruising in the islands. And this one piqued my interest because of the commercial activity in the back. And we weren't really sure what that was. But as we were looking through the row of slides on either side of this, we began to discern that this was actually a boat unloading sugarcane to be processed into rum down in Martinique. So just kind of an interesting insight into what island life was like and some of the manufacturing going on. Here's a great image of St. Kitts, a vendor on the beach selling a few things. The boat in the background with some busted out planks needs a little TLC, some time and attention. Another interesting image from Guadeloupe. Love to see lots of stray dogs around, but then this fellow here in the middle of the frame with his pith helmet on looks like he's reading some pronouncement. So again, vestiges of the colonial rule down in the islands during those days. This is one of my favorite images, just a native islander building his own boat right there on the beach under the palms. This is actually in Road Town in Tortola. And this is rush hour in Tortola on the site of what now, if you've ever been down to charter a boat from the moorings, that's more or less right in this area. So quite a lot of change over the years. This is an image we put in just because one of our trustees noticed it and thought it was of interest. This is a memorial to a British admiral called Admiral Rodney, who actually defeated the French down in the islands during the French and Spanish War in 1782. And the sort of curious thing about it, you can see Admiral Rodney there under that little rotunda, and he's had himself portrayed in a toga, as though he were some sort of Russian conqueror, I guess, or not Russian, Roman conqueror. Got a couple of chuckles out of that. This is Charlotte Amalie in St. Thomas. The first year Mitch went through the islands, they hardly saw any other recreational yachts. Very few Americans down there sailing until they came back up north and reached St. Thomas. And then they began to see other American cruisers down in the islands. And this I thought was interesting because you can see the traditional boat, native built boat in the background, and in the foreground is a relatively modern Snipe class, one design boat sort of sailing along down in St. Thomas. Here's a family outing on Caneel Bay. This is again overlooking Caneel Bay. You can see how few boats there are at anchor, and that's Carib in the background there. This is Charlotte Amalie again, just a working shipyard. You can see they're hauling a boat out on the marine railway. Just very simple life and lifestyle down in the islands at that point in time. Another classic image, this is actually back in Nassau, and this is just the working fleet. You can see what look like some sponge boats and dories in the foreground, working schooners in the middle ground, and then the warehouses along the piers in the background. This is the clubhouse at the Royal Nassau Sailing Club. And this is at Cable Beach in Nassau, and that boat caught our attention because we thought it looked sort of like a PT boat. And we weren't certain, but when we were down, again, down in Key Biscayne, one of the fellows in the audience identified it, and he's quite certain that was an air-sea rescue boat. So again, it's probably a World War II air-sea rescue boat that was turned out of service and converted into a private cruising yacht. You can see it does have that PT vessel shape to it. And then St. George's, Granada, just a beautiful picture of the harbor, and you can see how little development there really was. And then just for juxtaposition, essentially the same image, but in color. So the Mitchell collection numbers in the tens of thousands of images, most of them black and white, but later in his career, quite a lot of them in color. And a lot of what ended up in the Geographic was the color shots. Here's Carib again, and this is in Antigua at what they call Nelson's Dockyard. And that's actually one of the capstans that Nelson and his fleet would have used to careen their own vessels along the quay there in Antigua. So it's still there, untouched after hundreds of years. And I just think a fascinating shot. He talks a lot about being, you know, the only cruiser calling in a lot of these places, and tells this really charming story about, pardon me, about pulling into one harbor and a small skiff comes out with a man in it, and he's the representative of the governor of the island, and he's inviting Carleton Mitchell and his friends ashore to the governor's mansion for dinner. And he said that was not an uncommon occurrence to be invited ashore for these lavish meals at the homes of these dignitaries who really had very little opportunity to interact with people from outside of their own community. So they really felt like royalty when they were down there cruising. Just a few of the other books that he published, and we're going to transition now into kind of the next part of the story. This was the Rhodes design ketch after Alden's schooner. He had this ketch Caribbean, which he did a lot of racing on, and then ultimately designed his own boat, Finisterre. And so, like so many other sailors, right, the quest is always for the perfect boat. We all want the perfect boat. It has to be fast and sea kindly and attractive and dry and comfortable and commodious and accommodating. And Carleton Mitchell had a lot of miles at sea, both cruising, living aboard. He talks about, you know, taking 5 and 6 month trips on a regular basis down into the islands, but he also did a heck of a lot of racing. And so he had commissioned Olin Stevens to design him a boat. And of course, Olin at the time was designing these really modern, sleek, very narrow boats like Dorade and Stormy Weather, which were all well and good, but didn't really fit Carleton Mitchell's vision for a commodious and comfortable boat. So he actually went to New York, met with Olin Stevens, and they came up with this design, which was a bit of a collaboration for the two of them. And the design of the vessel ultimately would be called Finisterre. And Carleton Mitchell contracted with a small yard in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. Seth Pearson was the shipwright there. And this is Finisterre being framed up in the shop. She was to be 38 feet in length, 11 foot on the beam, 27.6 overall. Launched in 1954. She was too late for that year's Bermuda race, but she did go on to race in the Bermuda race in subsequent years.
Chris, it's Craig.
Yes.
We're still having trouble hearing you. We don't have a very good speaker system here. Could you try to keep close to your microphone?
Yep. Whoop. I lost you. Hang on. All right, I'll scooch up. Is that any better?
That's better.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So moving on, this is Finisterre coming out of the shop, and you can see the considerable beam that she has in the rather shallow draft relative to that beam. And you might remember from the early illustration, she was meant to be a keel centerboard boat, precisely because he wanted to be able to cruise into the shallow waters of the Bahamas and the islands, but he didn't want to compromise his upwind performance or his racing performance, so he gets the added depth from the centerboard. And it was sort of famously stated that when the boat was first launched and christened, Olin Stevens was there, and he said, well, Carleton, you've got a mighty fine looking boat there, but I don't expect you'll win many races. Just was not convinced at the prudence of this particular design compromise. There she is getting logoed up. And there she is underway. And next we're going to hear Carleton Mitchell talking about Finisterre in his own words, and sort of, I don't think lamenting, but explaining that Finisterre was the embodiment of all of his creative energies and talents. The novel he'd never write, the ballet he'd never produce, the opera he would never compose.
The opera I'll never write, the symphony I'll never compose, the ballet I'll never do, the great American novel I'll never write, all went into Finisterre.
So it was a vessel he was quite proud of. This is actually another image of Finisterre taken by the Rosenfelds, the other great photography collection housed in the CRC. The Rosenfeld collection numbers north of 1 million different images and covers American yachting from the very early 1800s right on up to the 20th century, including pretty much every America's Cup contested during that period. Anyway, so Finisterre, she missed that ocean Bermuda race the year she was launched by just a little bit. 2 years later, she contested for the St. David's Trophy and of course won. And so there's Carleton Mitchell with the first of what would become 3 consecutive St. David's Light trophies in succession, a feat I think unrivaled. And when asked about it by John Rumanier, he said, well, John, you know, I was just lucky. And John sort of chuckles and says, well, maybe, but you have to be mighty lucky because, as you know, what happens if you win the trophy, you get a different penalty in the subsequent years. And also, he sailed this boat in this race in varied conditions over basically 6 years, every other year, and yet managed to have the proper crew and the proper preparation and the proper skill to navigate Finisterre to 3 consecutive victories in the Bermuda race. So quite a story. He was very modest. He didn't like being on the podium, but nonetheless, he was there pretty frequently. This is the Nassau Cup being presented for the Miami-Nassau race. He campaigned the boat hard, always with the same crew. And he said it was all about preparation. He says in the Newport to Bermuda race, the night before the race, we were sitting aboard, drinking wine, having a fine meal, listening to records. He had a phonograph on board because he really liked listening to records. And he said everybody else was running around the dock trying to provision their boats and change their sails and get the rig set. And he said we were ready to go. And furthermore, we weren't a race boat, we were a cruising boat. We were ready to go to Bermuda, but if we had to, we could press right onto the Azores and keep on going. And that's just the way he approached it. It was all about life on the water for him. Next image is, we gave this talk up at the Eastern Yacht Club, and one of his perennial crew members was a fellow named Brad Noyes, and we knew that Mrs. Noyes would be in the audience that night. So we just picked this little news clipping from motorboating in 1969, which mentions his crew for that race, including her husband, Brad. And again, it's just, I guess, more evidence of the type of material that that's held in our collections and the storytelling that can be done with all these different assets. Here we are, the St. David's Light Trophy yet again being presented. And that's kind of brings us to the end of his sailing, racing, and the Finisterre story. And now we're gonna transition into some motorboating. So this was his first boat, Sans Terre. It was a Grand Banks 42. And you can see he's got his Cruising Club of America Burgee flying proudly up at the fore. And this was a transition for him. It was a perfectly natural transition. He was not embarrassed to give up on sailing. And it was very easily to justify because he could carry more wine and more records and scuba gear and really live quite a luxurious life on the water. We often ask, because we're not experts, ask members of the audience if they can help us identify different images. And this is one we've struggled with over many years to figure out. But we're pretty sure that's the bitter end down in the islands. Early days, again, here's the bitter end in Virgin Gorda. And in this image, a couple of things of interest. You see if I can amplify that in the back there. That's an early Bertram 31 Moppy. And Carleton Mitchell actually went in a Bertram motorboat in an offshore race, Miami to Nassau offshore race. And was Dick Bertram's navigator. And so that was kind of cool. And then you can see a sunfish here and dog on the dock and boats pulling in and just trying to enjoy the islands. Another interesting image of the bitter end in Virgin Gorda. And now just some image of the islands, really just to show how, I don't want to say desolate, but how sort of, how much it was country and not really well developed. So this is Road Bay Anguilla, as late as 1977. This is Gustavia Harbor in St. Bart's, again, in 1977. This is, mind you, now 30 years after his initial foray down there when he wrote Islands to Windward. It's still quite remote compared to today. This is Antigua Harbor, actually. And in 1977, he was offered the opportunity to buy waterfront property. And he was told, unfortunately, we can't give you the same deal that we gave to the English way back when, which was 1 cent per acre on a 99-year lease. But we can do is sell it to you outright for $2 an acre. And regrettably, he passed on buying any property down in Antigua at the time, but you can imagine what you pay for it today. And this is a picture of Ruth Mitchell on Sans Terre. And this is actually on the West Coast. And the story goes that the boat was being built in the Orient and it was due to get on the freighter to come back to the East Coast. And at the last minute, he woke up in a dream and said, why am I not sending the boat out to California? We've done no cruising on the West Coast. We should do that. And so he asked the freight forwarder, could they load the boat on a different ship? He said, absolutely. So they had the boat sent to California and they went cruising in California. And at some point during that cruise, down in the Sea of Cortez on the Baja Peninsula, one of the guests aboard, after a couple of drinks, said, you know, we really ought to go head out to the Galapagos. And Carleton Mitchell thought about it, and he said by the end of the second drink, we'd been in touch with the authorities to get clearance to land in the Galapagos and to have fuel brought out on a freighter. And so we set off, provisioned the boat, and set off the next day for the Galapagos. And this is just an image I'm going to show you here. When we were showing this to Ruth Mitchell, she talks about being on the boat and driving this little dinghy right through the gap in the rocks there, and you can just make out Finisterre moored in between. So anyways, off they go to the Galapagos. They arrive, they're immediately arrested by the naval authorities there, told they don't have clearance, and told no, they can't come ashore, and by the way, there's no fuel coming for you for many, many weeks. And so they decided what they would do is enjoy their time in the Galapagos until they got it sorted out. And ultimately they were able to get fuel delivered and clearance to land, and they made it back to the States. But just to give you a sense of life aboard, this is a holiday meal on board Finisterre with a roasted turkey, some good champagne, candlelight. You know, he just loved life afloat. That's all he really was interested in, is life afloat.
The South Coast, we heard that the seas were smaller, and we had problem getting to windward in Carib. So we went along the south coast of Haiti for a way, and the Gulf, and then finally decided that we just couldn't make it all the way eastward that year. So we came back and cruised the Gulf of Granada in Haiti, and then peeled off and went down the windward, across the Windward Passage with the wind, downwind to Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, and then around to the Isle of Pines and up around the.
You know what? I think I got a slide out of series, so I'm going to keep going. There's Finisterre again. He had a couple of other boats. This is a Hatteras trawler, a long-range cruiser called Cayoba. And this is Pied-à-Terre. This was one of the last vessels he owned, and the vessel on which we did a lot of the oral history recordings. This is another big boat that he kept down in Florida. But he also did quite a bit of cruising over in the Med. And I'm going to regroup again to point out this as, again, another little Bertram that he kept over in Portofino. And he described it as being akin to sleeping in a phone booth on its side, but that was not the point. He said, you know, the silliest question a landlubber can ask a sailor or a mariner is, how big is your boat? Because it really didn't matter to him. It was about life on the water. And he shares a story about how, you know, living aboard this little Bertram in Portofino, he was invited to go out sailing on all sorts of yachts, including one owned by Stavros Niarchos, the shipping magnate, that had a crew of 60 and was decorated with all sorts of old world masters paintings. And after listening to that in the oral history, we did a little research, and we're quite certain this is the boat. This is a schooner called Creole, ex Vera. It was owned by Stavros Niarchos. It's one of the oldest wooden schooners still sailing in the Med, and it's now owned by the Gucci family. So as Carleton Mitchell got older, he called our then president, Rebel Carr, one day and said, essentially, your dumpster or mine. I got to get rid of all this stuff and I don't want it anymore. How about you? And John Rumenier, the famous author, kind of brokered the deal of gifting this collection to Mystic Seaport. We think this is him signing over the collection to the museum. And this is what the collection looks like now. All the negatives, all the contact prints, all the proofs in boxes in that research center that we showed you. And what we did is, when we first got the collection, after it was cataloged and we'd gone through it, we mounted an exhibition to which we invited Carleton Mitchell and his wife. And it was just a really wonderful, wonderful opportunity to have him see the work of his career. And I think it was at that point he realized all that he had accomplished. And so I'm going to just skip back before I say thank you, I think. Hang on one second. Somehow my slides got out of whack. All right, we're going to try this one more time. Sorry about that.
The South Coast, we tried to beat,
So here he is at the show, great show, sort of the zenith of his career. And now I'm going to conclude with that audio clip of him talking about sailing down to the islands, and then a couple of slides just to show you what it must have been like. So let's see if I got it right now.
the South Coast, we tried to beat, we heard that the seas were smaller, and we had problem getting to windward in Carib. So we went along the south coast of Haiti for a way, and the Gulf, and then finally decided that we just couldn't make it all the way eastward that year. So we came back and cruised the Gulf of Granada in Haiti, and then peeled off and went down the windward, across the Windward Passage with the wind, downwind to Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, and then around to the Isle of Pines and up around the western side of Cuba to Havana, and then back up to Nassau.
And how long did that
I think we were there about 4 or 5 months.
and what'd you find?
Paradise.
And now is when I say thank you to all of you for hosting us this evening, and for Gallery Group to making this all possible, and apologize for somehow my slides getting juggled around there. But thanks for your time and attention. I don't know if there are questions, but I'm happy to stick around and try to answer some if there are any.
I have a question for you, Chris. So of all the things that we have over in the CRC and in our collection, right, the thousands and sometimes millions of artifacts, how did you get involved in the Carleton Mitchell story? What was it about his story that struck you?
Well, so I think it was actually my colleague, John. So John and I had been doing deep dives in the Rosenfeld collection and preparing talks all around the country. And the nice thing about Rosenfeld is you can be looking at a section of images about cruising in Maine and suddenly come upon speedboat racings in Chicago. And so now it's like, oh gosh, we got to go do a talk out in Chicago or Detroit. Or you find images of old Florida. So now we've got to go to talks in Florida. And somebody had turned him on to Carleton Mitchell's book. And he read that and was so fascinated, he decided to go start looking at the collection. And as soon as he opened up the first rounds of images, he just fell in love. And he said, Chris, we've got to do Carleton Mitchell talks. And I had known of the collection and known a little bit of his story, mostly the Finisterre aspects of his story. And so I went down the following day or 2 days later, and we spent probably 4 hours just going through these images and finding the most gorgeous images and just beautiful pictures. And so we decided we'd put a talk together, and thus far it's been pretty well received.
Okay. And what was the name of the book that kind of started it all again? I'll throw it in the chat.
Oh, was it Passage West? I'm going to forget the name. I'll have to go back and look at my slides. Hang on a second.
We had a question here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. You just talk. Talk to Mike.
While we're waiting for them, I put out a notice, forward a notice about the antique boat events that's going on maybe you could give a couple of words on that. And when are we going to resume the antique boat parade up by Abbott's is where I used to watch it from.
Yeah. So first off, Rebecca, the book is called Islands to Windward.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And this weekend is the Wooden Boat Show, which has been a perennial favorite here, put on by Wooden Boat Magazine, with all different restorers, vendors, builders, displaying a variety of watercraft here. It's a little later this season than in years past, but it will continue hopefully in the years to come earlier in the summer. And the antique boat parade, we tried it this year and we will continue to do it next year, hopefully with a little greater aplomb. This year was a little haphazard, just due to short staffing and short timing. But that event will return with vigor next year. And we're looking for actually a featured class or a featured vessel to showcase. So if you had any thoughts about, maybe it's the designs of Augie Nielsen, or maybe it's a particular one design boat, but we're always looking for ideas of a different class or a different group to feature in that parade.
What was your favorite aspect of Carleton Mitchell's work, Chris?
Yeah, I just think it was his approach, right? I mean, he probably had raced as many miles as he had cruised, and he was very competitive on the race course. But for him, it was all about the aesthetics of like life afloat and living on the boat and that rhythm of ship's life. And that's, I think, what resonates to me. I've been pretty lucky on a number of occasions to sail on our schooner Brilliant as part of the crew on Brilliant. And unlike, I grew up as a recreational sailor and I've done a fair bit and I've done a lot of racing, but I'm not a professional mariner. And going to sea with professional mariners, there's a sort of a rhythm to life aboard that is very different, and you really can just forget about the land. And I think that's why, Carleton Mitchell's boats, Finisterre, Sansterre, it's all about leaving the land, not being on the land. And I think that's the thing that really resonates with me, is just he was happy living a life afloat. Anyone else? I'm sorry if I was hard to hear for those of you in the room.
Okay, we'll figure it out. Anybody else online got a question for Chris?
Yeah, this is John. I do have one question. Did he ever make it to Puerto Rico?
I can't say that definitively, but I have to believe that yes, he did, because he cruised down on the island so many times over so many years. It would be hard for me to think he'd miss that. I mean, he was down there writing about all these exploits and really promoting visitation to the island. So I'm certain he was in Puerto Rico. I just can't make that as a statement of fact.
Okay, just curious. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question for you. How many of the Bermuda races did he lose?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure how many he sailed.
Ever the optimist in our group, ever the optimist.
I'm not sure how many he sailed in total, so I don't think I have that answer either. I'm just so fascinated by his ability to win 3 successive races. I haven't looked at the other side of the equation. It's easy to lose the race. Even I've done that. All right.
All right, well, if nobody else has any questions, we appreciate your time, Chris and Rebecca, and the Mystic Seaport Museum for coming out and giving us this wonderful presentation. And I think I heard that you got something going on this weekend, so maybe some of our people might be able to get down there and partake in the event with the wooden boats.
We'd love to have you.
Absolutely. And if we ever get back to doing these sorts of things in person, we'd be happy to make a trip up to Boston and meet all of you face to face one day.
Sounds like a plan.
With a different talk.
I hear you got a few.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All righty.
everybody. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. We'll see you next time. If anybody's got a better speaker, we can bring it along. So we'll see you on the water. By the way, I have room for crew tomorrow, Saturday, if anybody's interested. Oh, Sunday.
Good night.